Well, it's quite interesting that we're doing this here in the Conesville Methodist Church. I realized that my genesis has some roots here, actually. At the time, my mother attended here for, I guess, basically her whole life. And the Methodists would switch their pastors' districts around so that at the time my mother attended, my father attended the Blenheim Methodist Church, but they were served by the same pastor in the late 1940s, middle 1940s, George Moody. And I remember that my dad had met my mother at some interconnected church functions, maybe a youth group or something, and he followed a very proper decorum at the time. He asked George Moody to ask my mother's father, Freeland Case, if he might get to know her better. So one day after the service here, Mr. Moody asked my grandfather Freeland if it would be all right if Basil Sutton could visit and get to know my mother Ruth. And so it was with my grandfather's blessing that he did. Now my dad was a little bit older than my mom, 17 years, not uncommon in the historical settings of if we look back. But in spite of that, that did not seem to be an issue. And so my dad and mom, well, first I'll say this, my dad proposed to my mom down on the porch of the Backstriker homestead by the river down there. She was babysitting for Vi and Wally and must be somehow down there too. And then on June 16, 1948, Pastor Moody married my dad and mom right here in the church, and I was born the following year, May 16, 1949. My first home was in North Blenheim, where my dad and his brother and my grandfather rented the Everett Mattice farm. Everett Mattice at the time was Schoharie County supervisor, if I understand right, and he just didn't feel he could do a good job of being both county supervisor and farming it. So my grandfather Ernest rented it with my dad and my Uncle Gerald, and so my first residence was that house that still survives. I don't know how, it's at a lower elevation right below the Blenheim Bridge on the left. And I have a few memories from there, but I mostly remember Conesville because I frequently visited my grandparents, stayed over for the weekend sometimes. Of course, I had to get back for school, stayed over summer times. And every Sunday after church, not every Sunday, probably once a month, we came here to my grandparents and went to my grandparents Sutton and Jefferson one Sunday a month. The one thing that first comes to my memory was, as I have often said to people, the landscape here in the Catskills was dairy cattle. And I just touched by that. It must have made a wonderful impression on me. And the other thing I can say that I remember was community interdependence. We had the three small hamlets here in Conesville of Manorkill, Conesville, and West Conesville, and each had a store, and each had a church. And Manorkill, of course, had the creamery. Relating to the dairy cows, most hamlets had a creamery. I can remember one in, because I grew up in Bloomville, Delaware County, there was one in Bloomville, a Sheffield's, Dairymen's League in South Corite, a Sheffield's in Hobart, Prospect Dairy in Stanford, a Sheffield Creamery in Grand Gorge. My grandfather's milk was drawn by Louis Mattice, along with many others, my great uncle Earl Lewis, and Gilboa, and Les Buell, Charlie Buell, Stanley Brown, Carlton Lewis were all on, and Louis Matisse's milk, of course. We're all on that load going to Roxbury. But in the meantime, staying at my grandparents', there were many trucks still coming up the valley to the Manorkill Creamery. One that I remember the best was Wyckoff Brothers had a flatbed truck with their cans chained on securely, but the farm dog was always riding right on the back, you know, watching where he'd been as he rode up the valley. That's a very vivid picture in my mind. And that was just one of many milk trucks. But in the afternoon, the milk tanker, when all the milk had been collected, would come down the valley. It was one of the few tractor trailers at that time that we would see on the road. It was red and orange B model Mack owned by Fort Edward Express. It was driven by a man from Blenheim, Mr. Latourette, and it was probably going down to Middletown because this creamery at the time was Middletown Milk and Cream, which later became Deltown Foods, or later on Delwood. And so I remember my grandparents milking a lot by hand. They had a milk machine, but my grandfather not being a great mechanic, they just seemed to resort, and my aunts seemed to prefer to milk by hand. I don't know why that was, but I never was good at it. My grandfather also kept cattle on the place in Robinson Road in the summertime. And really, that's the point I have to make. There was very little land that wasn't pastured or cut for hay. And as we were, I can say thankfully that I remember part of my grandparents' routine was every other day or so after breakfast he'd shave. Every day the Word of God, the Bible, was brought out, and a little devotional book, the Daily Bread, was read, and the Lord was very much acknowledged. We ate well. My grandmother was a great cook. She worked in a barn and kept the house up. One of those amazing things that I don't know how people got, and they had an egg route too. And at that time, feed came in nice print bags, and my grandmother would take those feed bags and sew up aprons and various things. So besides the egg route, she would sell aprons and get a little household operating money, I guess. And my grandfather had horses, and he did have an Avery tractor in my first memory. Then in 1954, he bought the only thing that I think he ever bought new, a John Deere 40. Now, my Uncle Glenn was coming of age, and I always thought it might have something to do with, attracting the son to stay on the farm. He did buy a very nice registered Holstein bull at the Conesville Fair, which was a little upgrade from what farming was for them at the time. And yet my Uncle Glenn received a call from the Lord to minister the Word of God, and thankfully my grandparents did not try to override their agrarian sentiments in that case. But memories are secondhand, but they're well ingrained because my parents, as many challenges and hardships as people of that era had, and I'll say this, I often quote an old country music song that I remember the words were something like this: money's hard to come by, outside of that we're fine. And those days it was. And I like to also say, not only were we fine, but we were blessed, and they knew it, and they talked often of their past, even in the hardships and so on of it. It was still their life focus to think back on things like going to district school. I just told my granddaughter the other day, that be thankful you're getting on a nice warm school bus to go down to school, because my mother walked to school all year round. And yes, that's a connection too that we have here. Kim's grandmother, Helen Youngs, and her sister Irma and
Gosh, you're
Frida.
asking on camera. Frida,
Right.
yeah.
and their maiden names were Ruth. And my mother tells how they looked forward to the walk so they could meet up with their friends. They came to school right here,
Yeah.
where we know, and as the Kate Mattice residence for many years. I don't even know who lives there.
Yeah, it's right next to the store. It's the building right next to the store.
And so that, I know they're working on trying to determine how many years that school operated, but even after the central school came into being, I think in 1929, does that sound right? Some of the rural schoolhouses remained open, and they, I'm sure out of sentiment and that close sense of community, continued to go right here in Conesville at school. And I remember my mother telling how they would cut cross lots through the mine lot. The mine lot is significant here in Conesville's history, if you want to look in B's book of why that is. But that's a legacy here in town too. So I think it's on Eric's property or Lawrence's property up here. I've never actually been to the site. I would like to see it someday. I understand it's a hole in the ground and a heap of fill. And there were hopes of finding silver or gold, I believe. So they would get cold walking. I should have brought it today, but I remember one story my mother tells about your grandma. They had these little stuffed cat and little stuffed dog. The stuffed cat sat in the window of the house on Robinson Road. And one day, when Helen came to visit, she said, "Oh, I thought that was a real cat for years." So I'll have to get that so you can see it sometime, but we still have that. Well, so I grew up over in Delaware County on Shaw Road. It's right off Route 10 between South County and Bloomville, and attended South County School. Although after I lived in Blenheim, for a short time we lived in Jefferson on Fuller Road. And my dad and grandfather and uncle farmed it there. Then my dad in 1953 or 4 bought the farm in Bloomville. I call it Bloomville, South County. I think might have been our address originally. Everybody was milking cows, but quite honestly, as we all know, a lot of people didn't make it. All we have to do is look around now, and we are all gone now. I want to just pay tribute to Billy Tompkins, who was the last dairy producer here in the town of Conesville. I believe he was able to keep his cows until 2019, before the milk truck wouldn't come there anymore. We thankfully sold our cows after a good marketing year in the spring of 2015. I'm thankful to say my herd is still, probably some of them are deceased, and it's their daughters and granddaughters now up in Madison County near, in Peterborough, New York. And they're certified organic. I believe they're certified organic A2, which is kind of new to me, so I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but it's a very wholesome type of milk whereby even people that are considered lactose intolerant evidently can digest this milk and make good use of it. So then after that, I grew up there, had some farm jobs, went a little while to Del High Tech, but I was trying to farm it and go there both, and farming took precedent. Then my brothers and I actually outgrew the little farm in Bloomville, and we came to the town of Gilboa and rented the Morton Becker farm down on Route 30. Some of you will know where that is. After that, the Marie Foot Farm, I think that's also the town of Gilboa, over on South Gilboa Ridge Road, and finally the Ray Meehan Farm on Meehan Road, also South Gilboa. Our milk at that time, originally our milk went to the Roxbury Creamery and ended up in Blenheim and Tuscan, and then my brother John. So then Tuscan announced that they were no longer going to take canned milk, but bulk milk, and I decided to go back to my dad's farm with my two younger brothers, followed behind, and from our family, as soon as you could get a heifer to raise, you did it. And so my brother Tim and brother Leon, they had a few head of cattle, and we went back to Bloomville, and our milk went to Bovina. So after that, the Bovina Creamery closed, one by one. This is very important to our what happened here in these communities. As the creameries shut down, the can decks closed, it was a quantum leap economically for farmers to go bulk, build a bigger milk house in most cases, buy a bulk tank, which at the time was expensive, and so on. Probably half the dairy farmers went out in that era of the 1970s. In my recollection, I'm not exact on that, but so I had a lot of things going on. This is rather personal, but I had a lot of things going on in my life. I was blessed to get a call from God, and I'd like to tell people that I feel He called me at the mailbox. Our mailbox was 9/10 of a mile down on Route 10. We also walked down there to get on the school bus. My dad had a horse and buggy contract where the school wrote him a little check to see that us kids, because they didn't want to run the bus way up in our road for just us. So, but oftentimes, as I saw, I guess I'm sure I saw a wife, I'd get a Dear John note in the mailbox which said, "Ern, you're a nice guy, but I met Fred and he's a really nice guy." And so I had some of those experiences. One quite traumatic experience for me was losing my grandmother, Florence Lewis Case. And let me just say at this point, Florence's dad was also served as a pastor here in 1913, I believe 1912, 1913. He served in the Manorkill, Conesville, and West Conesville Church, and he drove his horse and buggy in between. He raised his family on what some might remember as the Earl Lewis Farm or the Carlton Lewis Farm above the Gilboa School and Cemetery on the left. And so they would finish chores, and they attended the Gilboa Methodist Church because that was closer. He also served for a while down in Milan, New York. That's Dutchess County, not far from where I lived for years. So at any rate, with all the demise of the dairy industry, and the other thing was, besides my grandmother's passing, I got a letter from Uncle Sam, come on over to Vietnam. And these three things really somehow impacted me at the time. So coming through that, I went back to Bloomville. I then went to work for well-known Catskill mountain icon Leonard Utter down on the Millbrook in Margaretville for a little while. Did the postgraduate school work a little bit at Margaretville. Then came back home to Bloomville, and our milk there went to Bovina Creamery for a short time, and then Bovina Creamery lost its U.S. public health rating in about 1973, and that really was the handwriting on the wall that I needed to get another course in my life. And I sold my cows, and I felt that I should really seek the Lord at the Word of Life Bible Institute, where I had attended Bible camp there in the 1950s and 60s, and so I did, and that was a real blessing for my life. The Lord and I had a real connection, and from there I met various people. But I do remember I came back to Bloomville, and I had met some people in my dorm that were connected with a ministry in Dutchess County, a guy that had started a church in a machinery shed. They put it that way. It had been used for machinery storage, but so I ended up there, and soon after, when I sold the cows back in the 70s after the canned milk era, I had no idea I was going to be milking again. And times had changed. I was able to get a bulk tank by trading a Scotch Highland heifer for a bulk tank with a farmer over here in Greene County. And it was not a big deal. They were actually still looking for milk in 2002, and we got in the creamery. At that time, I think for a little while we were the only ones in the town of Conesville. Joe Haskins, I believe, had just stopped, and I think he's down in Conesville or town of Gilboa.
Yeah, he's down in Conesville.
Okay, that's what I thought. And then shortly after, Billy got going, and he hung in there longer than we did. But I am very thankful to have the privilege of even still farming yet today, though I'm not milking. We board cattle for Roxbury Mountain Maple, and they lease our sat bush, we lease out the hunting rights, we lease out the wetlands to the government. So a little check here, a little check there. We're blessed to be in the watershed. They're a great supporter of the farmers. My grandfather and my dad did not have that. I need to say, in honor of my dad, even though he lost, I think he lost, maybe he just turned them in, but he lost 2 dairies, but he kept the farm, thankfully. So that gave my brothers and I a chance to get going in farming. And in those days, farmers didn't have a lot of money either. We worked for our neighbors for heifer calves and things like that, and we were able to get going. And so it was a great place to raise a family. That's part of our wonderful heritage. We had wonderful citizens for so long because people learned a work ethic, they learned a thrift ethic, and people help one another. I often think about how did people make it for these generations. It took them a few decades to clear our land. One thing we had going for us was we in Conesville were on the I-88 of its day. The Susquehanna Turnpike was a major travel route. That's why we see the Rickmeyer Tavern, our house, Jerry Colangelo's house, were all inns where people heading west for land. Land was the big issue. If you could only get some land, people lived off the land. But we lived in very marginal farmland here in the town of Conesville, and how farmers survived then was just quite a wonder in my mind. There's a few exceptions where people didn't make it. My mother tells of an elderly couple here in I think in the village of Conesville in the 1930s that actually starved to death because they didn't have a lot of money. They bought cornmeal at the feed store, and that was their breakfast, lunch, and supper. So they didn't have enough balanced diet. I don't remember their name just as well, I don't. But it was a shock to the town of Conesville, who was a tight-knit community, to think, oh, how did we miss this? How there wasn't a food pantry, sadly, at that time, and so on. Most farmers, if they didn't have any money in the checkbook, they still sat down to a good meal at night for producing food that they had owned. Yeah, I remember that Sunday afternoon, we saw the creek coming up on the flat, coming up, and sure enough, we decided to walk out and see, and it started washing out County Route 3 right below us, right between us and Tom Haskins and Jerry. And how we knew that something bad was going on down there. Cars were going down and turning around and coming back up the valley. And then we saw a motorcycle go down through, and he didn't come back. So then we decided we better walk down there and see what's going on, and the road had washed out. And the whole county, as we know, was so impacted. So thankfully, and I guess I should give credit here too, Eric Dahlberg began within a few days afterwards hauling in fill. The county was spread thin. They had so many roads to fix and everything. and they finally got back up here and reopened it. But many people here will have lots of stories of during that time cutting around South Mountain up in East Conesville in the Bear Kill to get from Manor Kill to Grand Gorge or something like that. The other thing is we are blessed to have the watershed. They've helped us a lot. They've helped me build fence. My grandfather's farm did sit empty for many years, and he got older, couldn't keep up with the work. And I do consider the most providential thing that we connected with the watershed. They built a lot of fence for us. They built a covered barnyard, put in water hydrants. So let me praise the watershed. They are like guardian angels to our farm. They also put in septics for people. We were blessed to have a septic from the Watershed Coalition over in Margaretville. We are known to have floods. And in fact, I have a nice article from Catskill Life magazine. Why did the early Schoharie County settlers settle the highlands first? Well, that's a weird question, but it's true. They were afraid of the floods in the Schoharie Valley around Middleburg and Schoharie. They went way up in Rossman Forest and the state lands. And we have this testimony here in the town of Conesville to this day. Stone walls, foundations, back on the higher elevations. Not too much land was wasted. And let me just say this about our farm. The first owners were Rick Myers. The one that built the house was Frederick Rickmeyer, a nephew of Uri Rickmeyer from the Rickmeyer Tavern. Our house, according to Bob Dowich, was built around 1815. We don't have any documentation, but just the way it's built, we have every reason to, and it was on the Susquehanna Turnpike. It looks just like Pump Tavern over in Cooperstown Farm Museum, which came from over here in Ashland. We're pretty sure it was a big inn hotel, and Frederick Rickmeyer is buried up behind on the farm along with some others. Then for many years, probably in the early 1800s, Stephen Hitchcock owned the farm up until the 1920s. Now, his family, that is. Stephen Hitchcock, according to an article I have written by Gary Stoner, built the Conesville Methodist Church with his brother Darius, who lived in West Conesville. Now, I misplaced that article, I'm anxious to find it again, but Stephen Hitchcock also, according to the census, around the 1860s, I believe, had 100 sheep and a sawmill. It was a wonderful way to bring the land back into production because sheep didn't need a lot of grass, and what better way to deal with all the timber and cut it up. Now that sawmill was right where the school bus and the cattle crossing sign are, down over where the creek cuts back in right by the road on 990B. I remember a lot of stonework there. Gary Case remembers a lot of stonework there from the spillway. Evidently the dam originally bridged right into that knoll across the creek from there, and according to B's book, it washed out in the big flood of 1887 when Conesville itself, which was then Stone Bridge, I believe, was decimated by the Great Flood. 1950, famous flood again in Conesville, took out Lawrence Fancher's dad's garage down here, and all the local farmers will tell you how a tractor disappeared. They say it's in the Gilboa Reservoir. I don't know how it can make it that far. But anyways, it was never found after the flood of 1950. 1950 was a bad flood. I think maybe in 1954, I do remember Hurricane Hazel as a boy. A lot of high water with that. Yeah, we have had some acts of God, as the insurance company will acknowledge, in the town of Conesville over the years. Well, it is nice to pass on to my children and my grandchildren what their lineage is. I believe lineage is an important thing. In our present day and age of many broken families, many people, to quote a dear friend of mine whose wife has done 2 books on the town of County Rte, don't know their family history, and that's probably a lot of it. But it even aids it when you live where you can just go to the cemetery and show children where their great-grandfather, their great-great-grandfather, and going on back. So recently, I gotta say this much too. Thank you, town of Gilboa, for clearing the Case Cemetery, which is out behind the Scott Hubbard barn, where our first forebears on up to Ira Case, who died in 1900, which would have been my great-great-grandfather, lived. And while I'm talking to Kim here, I got to say, they actually settled a lot of the land, which is now the Young's property. I believe your Uncle Steve told Gary, that one time in his excavations around there, he came across some of the parts of the sawmill there. And the log cabin, which was taken down in our grandfather's day, Gary, and on my grandfather's day. I have a picture in one of our family albums where in the 1980s, we got a picture of the foundation of it. I'm sure that's been excavated over by now, and I got to show you that. But yes, it is wonderful for our children's sake, for my own satisfaction's sake, and just the very fact that I did dream of having a farm. One day I had no idea it was going to be my own grandfather's farm, but we just, the Lord was good. That's all I can say. We were here. A blessed day of my life was when a young lady came up and invited me to Sunday dinner after church, and it turns out to be my wife, Jennifer. So we lived there many years, whereby our daughter Carrie and Katie and Mary were born. She's now my wife. I gotta bless my wife on this video. Besides raising now our own 3 and 5 more, which we thankfully eventually adopted, children, was caring for my mother and my aunt. They were somewhat self-sufficient, but as they aged, they got. And then her dad, who was not in her life a great deal, showed up too, and she started taking care of him because his leg was giving him trouble. Eventually he lost it, but so we were a packed household, and we came back in June of 2000. So life has been kind of like a big circle, I guess, in a lot of ways. A dairy farmer, yes, he's got to work to make it. He's honest.